Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And I don't do this very often, but I think some stories are so significant and important that we should clarify a few points if we possibly got distracted during the news bulletin. Simon Conway, LBC's award-winning newsreader, joins me on the line now. Did you say lemon and elderflower, Simon?
I did, yes. Lemon elderflower cake. Yeah.
Excellent. And icing? Do we know anything about the icing?
Yes, the icing is going to be a buttercream and decorated with fresh flowers. So there you go.
Edible flowers, or...?
Well, as far as I know, I would have thought so. I wouldn't have thought they'd put non-edible flowers on.
Probably a nasturtium or something like that, perhaps.
I don't know much about edible flowers, so I can't add much more than that, I'm afraid.
Your expertise has already delighted us. And do we know, finally, how many tiers the cake is likely to have?
No, not much detail yet. I would have thought that will come in the 2 months, less than 2 months now, until the big day.
And rest assured that when that information does become publicly available, Simon Conway and myself will bring it to you first, live on LBC. Simon, as ever, many thanks for your professionalism and insight.
Pleasure.
5 minutes after 11 is the time. We move on from Harry and Meghan Markle's wedding cake to the rather less important territory of nationwide industrial-scale manipulation of voters by, well... I guess they deny it, but you need to hear what the main man said. This is a story that's been bubbling under for a while. My problem is that I've considered it to be true from pretty much the outset, with just a couple of wobbles when I thought, could something this huge really have been undertaken? But when you look at the election of Donald Trump in America, and you're not a white supremacist apologist for sex offenders, you have to wonder how this could have happened. How could lots of people who presumably don't ordinarily, or didn't begin from a position of supporting sex offenders and racists, how could they have ended up thinking that this fellow was somehow the answer to their prayers? Well, it's easy. He wasn't the answer to their prayers. He was the sop to their fears, and their fears were built online by essentially, I hope I've understood this correctly, we're going to speak to the journalist who led the Channel 4 investigation in about half an hour, but if you know or you've seen, and I obviously living in whatever the phrase is for the very opposite of an echo chamber, I've been exposed to this for the best part of 2 years. People absolutely persuaded that their little village in Devon is about to be subsumed by a horde of Syrian refugees who are actually terrorists. People completely certain that unless they vote to leave the European Union or vote for Donald Trump, then Sharia law will be taking hold in Shrewsbury by tea time. And you start off finding it funny, and then you find it tiresome, and then you find it terrifying, because it works. And how do we know that it works? Because the managing director of Cambridge Analytica has told Channel 4 in an undercover meeting precisely how it works.
The two fundamental human drivers when it comes to taking information on board effectively are hopes and fears, and many of those are unspoken and even unconscious. You didn't know that was a fear until you saw something that just evoked that reaction from you.
Right.
And our job is to drop the bucket further down the well than anybody else, to understand what are those really deep-seated underlying fears, concerns. There's no good fighting an election campaign on the facts, because actually it's all about emotion.
And what would those videos be? Well, they would, of course, include the so-called alt-right news websites that have been peddling nonsense about fruit juice cartons turning you gay and vapor trails behind aeroplanes being part of a government plot to hypnotise us all for years. How do I know? Well, because it happened to a friend of mine. And it really upset me at the time, because he's a decent bloke. And he just fell for it, hook, line and sinker, and I couldn't understand why until I started asking to see the stuff that he was watching. So you'd stick on an InfoWars tape, and I'd say to him, do you know... Actually, this is more recent, actually. I'd say to him, do you know that they make most of their money by selling brain juice? All of these people on this so-called platform conclude their broadcast by encouraging you to buy pills to make your brain more powerful. And you sort of go, is that really the guy you're going to trust? But of course what you then have is Donald Trump turning around and saying, this is the guy that I trust. So how can Hank in Arkansas recognise that what he's swallowing is utter bunkum if the President of the United States of America is saying this guy is trustworthy? And then you got all the Islamophobic stuff, all the kind of that mindset, which I still struggle to get inside. But you see it every time a relevant story pops up, where you say, look, if he's a terrorist, good. If he's blown himself up, I won't be losing any sleep about him. If he's in a grooming gang, lock him up and chuck away the key. I've got absolutely no problem with the heaviest hit of law to arrive on these people's shoulders. But for a certain type of punter, that's not enough. You have to believe that all Muslims are terrorists and paedophiles. Otherwise, you're somehow the enemy. How could you possibly end up in that position, especially if you ever met any Muslim people? Well, answer, your Facebook feed is full of it. Absolutely full of it. That was Mark Turnbull, the managing director of Cambridge Analytica. There is a chief executive by the name of Alexander Nix. A lot of people are mentioning that he went to Eton. I don't think that's fair. I appreciate that this will undermine my working class hero credentials fairly fatally, but some of my best friends went to Eton. You don't leave that school having an attitude to the poor that Jacob Rees-Mogg best exemplifies when he describes food banks as uplifting. You leave that school like you leave any other school, some good, some bad. The only thing you've got that you don't get from anywhere else is a belief that you are actually entitled to run the world. And even that I could probably make a positive of if I had time. But 10 minutes after 11, here's Alexander Nix offering to, well, you work it out for yourself.
Deep digging is interesting, but, equally effective can be just to go and speak to the incumbents and to offer them a deal that's too good to be true and make sure that that's video recorded. These sorts of tactics are very effective. Instantly having video evidence of corruption, putting it on the internet, these sorts of things.
And the operative you will use for this is who?
Well, someone known to us.
Okay, so it is somebody, you won't use a Sri Lankan person, no? Because then there's issue.
We'll have a wealthy developer come in, somebody posing as a wealthy developer.
I'm a master of disguise.
Yes. They will offer a large amount of money to the candidate to finance his campaign in exchange for land, for instance. We'll have the whole thing recorded on cameras, blank out the face of our guy, and we're going to post it on the internet.
So it'll on the Facebook or YouTube or something like this, it will be.
We'll send some girls around to the candidate's house. We have lots of history of things. We can bring some Ukrainians in on holiday with us.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. They are very beautiful Ukrainian girls.
They are very beautiful.
Yes.
I find that works very well. I mean, it sounds a dreadful thing to say, but these are things that don't necessarily need to be true, as long as they're believable.
Just a couple of samples from this Channel 4 investigation. The Observer and a journalist called Carol Cadwallader, who will be joining us later this week, hopefully to take your calls, actually. She's just incredibly busy at the moment, have sort of led the field on this. There is not really any dispute now that it's true. It is pretty much the case that the accusation, let's leave it in the realms of allegation, because I haven't got a lawyer in my pocket at the moment. The allegation is that some 50 million people had their details mined on Facebook, and then their Facebook feeds were essentially tailored to feed and inflame their fears. So you could tell, apparently, from a personality test or from a little bit of scrutiny, whether or not I was the kind of person who could be persuaded that the city in which I have lived since the age of 19 was full of no-go zones that I couldn't actually enter because of all the brown people who'd do me harm. You could work out from my Facebook responses on my Facebook feed whether I could fall into that category. Or you could work out whether or not I could be persuaded, despite having lots of Muslim friends, that they're all secretly paedophiles and terrorists. And how many people now are feeling the clouds clear? How many people are thinking about their brother-in-law and going, oh my God, yeah, that's him? Or their mum? Or their sister. That's it. So they'd work out from your Facebook feed whether or not you were susceptible to this sort of stuff. On the other side of the Atlantic, obviously it's build the wall type stuff and people that have never left Reno who are absolutely persuaded that you can't go to Derby. Do you remember there was a brilliant, and the Russians, of course, have been backing it all up online. But my favourite example of that was an American Fox News fan, stroke Russian bot, tweeting that you can't, there are places in Birmingham now that are no-go zones. And someone replied and said, well, I grew up in Brum and I don't know what you're talking about. And this American replied and said, I think you'll find I was talking about Birmingham. Do your research. He said, all right, Igor, on you go, on your jog. So, I mean, this is what has happened. And it's the only thing that, for people like me, it's the only thing that ever made sense, was that epic amounts of industrial-scale propaganda were being undertaken on both sides of the Atlantic to persuade people. And I feel a bit guilty, because some of the most viral clips we've done, some of the calls that have been all around the world and back, you know, actually making headlines in foreign newspapers, some of the callers we've taken on these issues, particularly Brexit, you inevitably end up poking fun at them. You can never humiliate them with your words as much as they humiliate themselves with their own. But you realise when you clock all this Cambridge Analytica stuff, you realise that it wasn't their fault. The confidence you need to ring me, a lot of people say, why do they still ring you? And I say, well, because the confidence you need to ring me comes from your news sources. Did you hear that lady last week? Was it Kathy last week? Who was proud of the fact that she knew nothing. She said, oh, well, you're an intellect and you travel. As if they were bad things. I said, where do you get your news from? And the answer was essentially her laptop. That confidence is really hard to breach. You only breach it when you find yourself coming unexpectedly face-to-face with reality, which you can do by dialing 0345 6060 973. And that's why it keeps on happening. As lots of people say, why does it keep on happening? If they never... The answer is because if you are immersed in this worldview where all Muslims are paedophiles and terrorists, all immigrants are both stealing your jobs and taking your benefits, all patients on the NHS have arrived there an hour ago from Nigeria. If this is what you're getting, then people like me just sound mad. And then you ring me up and I ask you for some facts and evidence to back up the stuff that your Facebook feed is full of, and you fall apart like a cheap suit. Or, deep down, you know that this is all racist propaganda, but you quite like it, because immigration is the best excuse that anybody has ever had for not doing as well in life as they think they should have done. So then they're less likely to ring in, but they'll be all over social media claiming that it's all true. Build the wall. Hillary Clinton's advisors ran a paedophile ring from a pizza parlour in. You see, you say it out loud. People like you and me don't understand how anyone could ever have believed it. But imagine that was all you ever heard. And imagine a Wizard of Oz type figure in a laboratory, in a computer lab, is deliberately bombarding your Facebook feed, which for many people is their primary news source, with racist lies. What are you going to end up being? Not a racist liar necessarily, but a believer of racist lies. And of course, when I pointed all of this out on Twitter earlier and suggested that it makes perfect sense and that people who have been brainwashed into believing all this nonsense are unlikely to believe it, unlikely to admit it or recognise it, one or two of you pointed out that there was a touch of pot kettle black going on, making such points from a position of employment on this radio station. And I can't really argue with that. We've just tweeted from the LBC account that clip I was telling you about. The woman who rang in last week and effectively proves exactly what happens when your Facebook feed is hijacked in a slightly sinister way. Let me read you some of the detail on the how they get the Facebook thing up and running. It's incredible. The strength of the modelling was illustrated by how well it could predict a subject's answers. Okay, so one of the people named in this report continued to work on the models incessantly, and before long he was able to evaluate a person better than the average work colleague, merely on the basis of 10 Facebook likes. 70 likes were enough to outdo what a person's friends knew. 150 likes, you get a better indication of someone's personality type than their parents had. This is quite... And Gavin sent me this. I'm reading it out unchecked because Gavin looks like a decent fella. But I mentioned that as a caveat. 300 likes, you get a better indication of my personality than my partner would be able to provide in a sort of psychological testing environment. Any more likes than that, you could end up knowing more about a person and what they believe than they actually knew themselves. When he published his findings, he received 2 phone calls, the threat of a lawsuit and a job offer. both from Facebook. I need to check the provenance of that, Gavin, please, but it's utterly, utterly believable. So, the way we're doing this story is to ask if suddenly it all makes sense. Your friend, your family member, possibly even your partner, your parent, your sibling, your son, now you get it. Because their Facebook feed has been deliberately manipulated to feed their most primal and ancient of fears. They have been turned into, if you will, kind of cannon fodder for politicians seeking election on the back of xenophobia and racism, cue Brexit and Trump. So does it now make sense? It made sense to me a while ago, but I didn't think it was widespread. I didn't understand until David and Almit, I'll be with you imminently. I just want to get this out there. Because the friend I'm talking about, I presumed he was just not unlucky, but because he had a lot of time on his hands, he wasn't working at the time, I presumed he was going into the internet and finding it all. Do you see? I presumed he was doing searches, but I spoke to him about it earlier this week, and it wasn't. Once you've liked a few things, he'd get loads more. So you start off liking an article in The Spectator, which is kind of posh Islamophobia, and you end up getting bombarded with videos from InfoWars. And no one's explained to you how this is going to happen. But you put a like on something that is, you know, chalk stripe racist rather than bother boot racist, and that starts a process. I think, I mean, I'm still groping around in the dark on this, but quite how my friend's Facebook feed ended up being full of far-right propaganda used to baffle me. And it doesn't anymore. And it also explains how someone who's never left Texas can believe that they have a better understanding of the dynamics, the social dynamics of Birmingham and Tower Hamlets than the people who actually live there do. It is actually incredible when you think about it. How can you bring people back from this position? Can we get them back out of the rabbit hole? So I'd love to talk to you if you've been down the rabbit hole and managed to get yourself out again. But I don't think at this point people are going to queue up to tell me that they were conned. I don't think we're there yet. But I think, like me, you've probably got someone in your life whose decline into chomping, hate-filled madness now makes perfect sense. 03456060973. David's in Stevenage. David, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
It's funny, I've had a very, very similar experience to the one you just described. And I hate to say, the only way to get people out of the rabbit hole is to take their laptops away, which will probably appear in a video popping up on Facebook later that a lefty wants to take laptops away.
Yeah, you're probably right.
I had someone grow up very, very close to me, a family member. We grew up with the same experiences, Irish parents.
I just want to. Can we do anything about the phone line? It's just a little bit muffled. I can tell this is going to be an interest. It is a lot better. Yeah, carry on.
Okay, yeah. Grew up together, similar families, Irish parents, same experiences. We both understood the situation in Northern Ireland and understood that there was two different narratives: a story you heard over there, a story here.
Yeah.
Now, what I've really found is that years ago, when you formed your public or your private opinions, it was based on debates. Now what's happening is you're just forming your opinions on diatribes. Now, this person that was very close to me, all of a sudden, it was pretty much around the Trump election, started coming out with this stuff that I was really, really surprised about. It was just frightening stuff, fear, and it was more about Hillary, and it was more about the danger of the Democrats, and it was about anything positive.
Now, what did you think he was doing? Because your feed's not full of this stuff, because you haven't liked a couple of Britain First clips and ended up being sort of manipulated and programmed in this way. So where did you think he was getting it from?
Well, I think he's getting it because it's so much sexier, and as a famous quote you say, but it's so much sexier to look at stuff that might frighten you.
Yes.
And he's always on Facebook but never posts, and it was constant. I remember one occasion that I sent him a clip of John Pilger, and it was nothing to do about politics. It was nothing to do about Brexit or anything like that. And he said, I'll watch that after I've watched Alex Jones and Paul Joseph Watson.
Ooh.
And I didn't know who these people were, and so I looked up.
For other people who don't, they are the ones who essentially sell brain juice.
Yeah, they're the ones that say, there was a murder in Catalonia by someone with brown skin, and that means you should all go and march down Bury Park. And
that's a pretty good, actually, distillation of the whole thing. And you, like me, find it silly until you see what it does to people like your family member stroke cousin.
But then it grows, and that's the terrible thing when it grows. And what happens is you do start to seek it out. Now, I did something then.
Yeah.
I started looking at these things on my Facebook, and I signed up for Trump for USA, And I started getting all these things, and my newsfeed's just completely confused. But once you start watching, especially things like Tommy Robinson, there's this little voice in the back of your head that goes, you know what, he's got a point there.
And every time a crime is committed by a brown person, despite not obeying any laws of logic, it fits in with the worldview that you're being sold. They're all bad. They're all paedophiles or terrorists. I've read the Quran and I know they're all evil. That kind you sort of go, yeah.
I would not like to get into a debate with Tommy Robinson, because when he talks, what he's saying is this is bad and this is bad, and don't you think this is bad and this is bad? And of course it's bad. But that's all you're telling. If you're only telling people about all of these terrible, terrible things that these individuals have done, and you put them up all together, it then looks like a movement of people doing bad things towards you. And
these people, I wouldn't say I have sympathy for the fellow you mentioned, but I do think if he wore chalk-striped suits, he'd be on Question Time. I think he's a victim of class prejudice, while he's also punting all manner of other possible prejudices. What happens when you try and tell your family member what's going? Because this is where my friend and I came pretty close, and I've known him since I was 16. It's the closest we've ever come to going our separate ways, because there's a refusal to believe. So you could say, for example, in my case, I'd say, well, hang on a minute, mate, look, is the Catholic Church, does that mean I'm a paedophile because the Vatican is riddled with them? Or I'd say, well, I've read the Old Testament, so what happened?
What I find is they say, where do you read that? Because nowadays everyone says, right, we have an access, because of the internet, you have to prove everything, you have to back it up. And then wherever your source is from fits into I believe that camp or I don't believe that camp. And it can be anything, even as, as well researched as the BBC. And you'll say, oh, well, it's on the BBC. Obviously, they're going to say that.
Yeah.
And you can't fight from that. It's become like football teams now. There are sources that you believe and people you believe, and there are people that are on the other side, and there are sources you don't believe and the people you don't believe, and that's where we are at the moment.
Well, and that's how we've ended up with what we've got. Is he still down the rabbit hole?
Well, it's a situation now where I would never bring up anything political, and nor would he.
Which is how you avoid taking chunks out of each other, but it means that he's still languishing under the delusions of the manipulators and propagandists that have pushed him into this position. And you can see why they do it. There's money in it, You always start the clock on when somebody far right on the internet, start the clock on when they first appear and when they start asking you for money. Always. Without fail. But again, people like David and I can say this to people in our lives until we're blue in the face. And it won't register. That's the next stage, and I've got no idea what it's going to look like. It's 11:30. Do you remember the call we took before Christmas? The Daily Mail rotted my grandmother's brain ended up being the headline on it. Such is the nature of clickbait, or whatever they call it. I think that this Cambridge Analytica story fits into very similar territory. The number of people who've been in touch with me who've described... I remember 2 years ago, that man telling us his wife made him put his laptop away because his feed was just full of hate. My old slightly inadequate catchphrase, it's a lot easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than it is to sell tickets for the speak your weight machine. There's something that we enjoy about being frightened, and when our fears turn into votes, you end up with Donald Trump in the White House and Brexit in Britain, although the last bit may just be my analysis. Andy Davis is the Home Affairs correspondent at Channel 4 News who fronted last night's investigation into Cambridge Analytica. I think he might just have picked up his phone after doorstepping Alexander Nix, the chief executive of the company, this morning. So we're doubly grateful for your time, Andy. Begin by telling me whether you knew what you were going to find in terms of quantity or quality when you started this investigation.
I think when it was our investigation team led by Joe Brabkin back in November went in, and I think they had an idea about the sort of thing that they might come across, but it was only in the last meeting when Alexander Nix pitched up, who's the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, that we got the most sort of extraordinary disclosures from him about what his company might be prepared to do. Now, was it bravado when he was talking about, options of potential entrapment with Ukrainian women, or was there actually some background to that? I don't know. We don't know what the truth of it is, but I think it tells you a lot about the type of company that is out there influencing political elections around the world.
In return for money, obviously.
Yes. I mean, I don't know how well paid they are. I certainly know that, Chris Wiley, the whistleblower who spoke to The Observer, the New York Times, and us over the weekend, said that that Cambridge Analytica got, I think, $1 million to conduct the research into that initial Facebook harvesting back in 2014, because Cambridge Analytica had the backing of Steve Bannon and the billionaire Republican funder Robert Mercer. So there is a lot of money involved.
Also, I think that
2014.
They were both behind Breitbart as well, which will be the kind of quotes news end quotes organisation that is popping up in the feeds of the people who've been identified as susceptible to the hate mongering.
Well, they've got, this is what Chris Wiley was saying, that you had Steve Bannon there, this alt-right ideologue, as a sort of de facto founding father of Cambridge Analytica. And Wiley told us that, he went in there with these liberal ideals. He describes himself as a progressive liberal and felt that the direction they were taking was completely opposed to what he wanted. Cambridge Analytica said that, they don't have any political ideology. They'll work across the political mainstream, but that's not what Wiley found.
No. And Nix, of course, came out with a refutation before your film had actually been broadcast. He told Newsnight, I think their undercover sting was intended to embarrass us by presenting a mischaracterisation of the facts. It's a position that's somewhat undermined by the verbatim recordings that we've just played out on the programme. There's more to come, I believe, Andy Davis.
Yeah, there's more of that undercover investigation tonight with the focus on the US. But it was interesting what he said when he came out and said we'd mischaracterised, and what they were doing was trying to tease out what this client was like, and they had grave concerns over this client. But, they had grave concerns, they claim now, back in January, and yet we know that 7 weeks later they were emailing our undercover reporter saying, hey, what's going on with this impending partnership? Still apparently chasing, still keen.
Gosh. This is a slightly odd question, and you don't have to answer it. I know you're very busy, and you're at the Cambridge Analytica doorstep at the moment. But have you...
Hello?
Oh.
Sorry, you just broke up. Can you just repeat that?
Of course I can. You don't have to answer this question, Andy, because it's personal rather than professional. But have you come across yourself the ramifications of these harvestings? I mean, have you got anyone in your life who suddenly you understand how they've ended up so far down a rabbit hole?
Personally not. But all I would say is that I think one of the striking things for me in all of this is just how little we know, how ill-equipped we are to know how our data could be used. And I know that's what's been said a lot recently. But I think I'm also just shocked at how little we know about a company like Cambridge Analytica, which now claims to be the most significant political consultancy in the world, and what they're actually doing. We don't know where they're working in across the world at the moment because they don't talk about it. And this inability to scrutinise what's happening with political parties, who they're employing, what tactics they're using, I think is a worry for all of us.
And for anyone who cares about transparency, accountability, and indeed democracy. We know more than we did before you and your colleagues started your investigation, Andy Davis. More power to your... Oh, did Mr. Nix say anything to you this morning when he turned up for work?
He did, James. My first question was, have you ever used entrapment in the past? Because that's what you appeared to offer our undercover reporter. And he smiled and said, appearances can be deceptive. I followed it up with the question, are you going to abandon your political work now? And he gave a long, deep sigh, but no response. And then I asked him if he'd misled Parliament over the Facebook issue, which is an allegation that's been put. He said absolutely not, and with that he was bundled into his office.
More tonight, Channel 4 News, 7 p.m. Andy Davis, Home Affairs correspondent for the aforementioned. Many thanks indeed. 11:42 is the time. I'm sticking with this question because I think it's really helpful, and I know that if you're still convinced that Hillary Clinton's key aides ran a paedophile ring from a New York pizza parlour, if you're still convinced that fruit juice cartons can turn your children gay, if you're still convinced that all Muslims are paedophiles and terrorists and the ones who don't seem to be are just pretending, or you're still convinced that the Sandy Hook massacre and possibly the one in Florida last month, they're all hoaxes undertaken by actors, designed. If you think that the assassination attempt in Salisbury was arranged by the government to derail Brexit, if you're buying into all of these things, and you still are, I can't help you. I love you, and I'll be here when you see the light, but right now I can't help you. All I can do is show you the way out of the rabbit hole by speaking to people perhaps who have already found it or who have already identified its existence. Amit is in Shoreditch. Sorry to keep you for so long, Amit. What would you like to say?
That's all right. Well, James, I'm in a bit of an unusual position. I come from a Muslim immigrant family, but I have a younger brother who's a Tommy Robinson loving, EDL following, I don't know the word for it, lunatic.
How did that happen then?
Well, I'd say it'd be mainly, the internet. I appreciate it's not completely to do with Analytica, what you're talking about today, but in terms of...
It might be. If it depends on, how much of it is coming through Facebook and stuff.
Well, he's not on Facebook. But
it's not that then.
He does watch a lot of YouTube, and it seems to be indicative of the people who only get their information of the world from online. Like that is where he gets his worldview from. And Tommy Robinson is like someone he borderline venerates. And I try and talk to him about it and try and discuss it with him, but he just doesn't have any. It's turning him ugly. And this is the thing. I'm trying to.
But this is where you and I perhaps needed slightly different personality to understand it, because he's choosing that ugliness. It almost feeds something in him that you and I just don't understand. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I'd say it definitely rings true. I mean, he seems to just only look out for the worst news. It's almost like this worship of evil that he has, where he just looks out for it and it feeds it. And then when I'm trying to tell him fine, you can be critical of religion. Like I'm atheist. I come from a secular. My background's Turkish. It's a secular. Was very secular. I'm trying to explain to him about you can have these views, but not have the ugliness of people like Robertson have. Like there is, and that's the point. There are kernels to truth to what he says in some instances, and it's the way they latch onto these kernels. I'd say just on the other hand, like you'd get some extremists where you get charismatic preachers talk about.
But it works the same way, doesn't it? It's the same buttons that are being pushed. It's two cheeks of the same backside.
Exactly. So it's.
I suppose then we should. I suppose it'd be grateful your brother's gone that way instead of gone the Islamist way, because at this point, at this point in British history, the kind of weird white racists don't do as much harm. Well, I suppose we're catching up, aren't we? But if it's the same buttons that are being pushed by the same propaganda but just a different flavour, then I don't know, mate. What are you going to do?
I don't know. It's concerning because it seems to be getting worse. I'm trying to.
Well, the grooming gangs always ramp it up another level, because people like you and me can sit here and say these men appear to have a commonality. There seems to be an amazing preponderance of people of Pakistani origin and therefore ostensibly of the Muslim faith. These crimes are absolutely disgusting. They should be locked up and the keys should be thrown away. Investigations should be undertaken. Inquiries should be done. But that's not enough, you see, to people like your brother and his mates. They think we should really be concluding that all Muslims are actually secretly paedophiles and terrorists, and unless you go on that, then you are somehow an apologist or denying or...
Yeah, exactly. He seems to think he has some truth that we're unaware of.
That's it, isn't it? And that's sexy.
He scoffs at the idea of when I try and talk to him about nuance, and it's not that straightforward. And
makes him feel special. I know you don't get it, I do.
In a way, and he'll scoff at the idea of when you just try and have some sort of informed discussion. But I mean, but I'm really concerned about the way it is actually getting worse. The way that, so going back to Robinson, because he's a person I particularly dislike. So before, my brother used to hate people like Donald Trump. He hated Donald Trump. He thought he was an idiot.
Yeah.
But now, because Robinson is coming out defending Donald Trump, he's like, no,
I'll have to take your word for that.
Yeah.
But it goes with the territory, of course, because of the demonisation of all Muslims, the ban upon people from Muslim countries, except the ones where he's trying to build hotels. They're still allowed to come into America, and except Saudi Arabia as well, which sponsors the kind of Islamist terrorism that his reason for banning Muslims from America was supposed to combat. But hey, these are details, and people like your brother don't like the details. They only like the slogans. And Facebook and the combination of data harvesting and the allegations, the alleged behaviour of Cambridge Analytica create a Petri dish. That's what it is. It's a Petri dish. in which you can fester, uninterrupted and unmolested and unbothered by reality. It's just mould upon mould upon mould. And it does feel as if the planets are aligning somewhat. Poor Kathy last week, essentially boasting about the fact that she gets all of her information and news from the internet, from, in her words, YouTube and UKIP and common sense. And that's how you end up with... For two things that have happened. The first is that we've afforded equal positions to opinions. Now, that's really dangerous. I've written a piece about this for the next issue of the New Statesman, if you're interested. I explore it a little bit further. Two opinions are not the same. You can't have two opinions the same. For example, if you think the Earth is flat, and I don't, our opinions are not of equal value. Because, well, evidence and proof. And while science always accepts that there may come along later a better explanation for the available evidence, as more evidence becomes available, the current available evidence means that if you believe the Earth is flat and I believe the Earth is round, your opinion isn't worth the same as mine. And that really, in PhD theses of the future, that will be the fulcrum of all Brexit analysis. This notion that somebody who's not very clever, saying largely racist things in a posh accent, his opinion is worth as much as that bloke over there who spent his whole life studying the issues. That will be the conclusion. But how do you bring the people with you? Well, a large part of it, I suspect, will turn out to have been the social media manipulation, the harvesting of data. Because I never quite got this. Why my mate's Facebook feed? Because I'm on Facebook, but I keep my page private, so I don't get a bombardment of news and suggestions on it. I didn't understand why his Facebook feed was constantly popping up with videos of obscure American academics making cases for borderline genocide, why it was full of far-right organisations. What do they call the ones that just got removed? That Donald Britain First ended up with 2 million likes. Because if you see what people were liking, they didn't really realise what they were signing up to. They were just liking that one tweet. But when you harvest the 20 things they've liked, you then feed them a kind of very bespoke diet of hatred and anger. And it works. It works because it sets off little triggers in our brain when we're frightened. You get addicted to it. And that is, as a lot of you are pointing out, I'll stop putting words in your mouth. Ryan is in Brighton. Ryan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Actually, similar to the last guy with his brother. I mean, my dad, he's always had some strange views about the world. Sure. With conspiracy theories. But he went through a reunion with some people in the army when he was a teenager. Now he's in the army to go out.
No, I can't. There's 2 calls running. The phone line's gone completely nuts since you came on the line. Is there anything we can do about it in the short term? Can you give it a jiggle? I didn't... No, we've just dropped off now as well. We'll try and get him back. Craig's in Birmingham. Craig, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James.
Hello, mate.
I'd just like to say I absolutely agree with the sentiment and the discussion that you're having, but it's like who do we have as the opposite narrative? You know, I think with regards to, Nick Griffin, when he was welcomed onto Question Time, and how he was absolutely destroyed in his views, and how people could then see how ridiculous they were. And I think if we kind of go about, saying Breitbart and InfoWars and everything else and shutting these people down, surely we should be saying to people, no, look, let's bring it out. Let's scrutinise it more. This is the challenge for the profession, and it's odd that you should mention that, because the Christopher Hitchens Memorial Lecture at the Hay on Wye Literary Festival this year addresses precisely this point. Ask me how I know that, Craig. How do you know that?
Because I'm giving it, mate. So the point is that you have to have some sort of return to an objective standard of truth. And that the problem with that is, when you've got the fellow, the InfoWars person in particular, flogging the notion that the school massacre is a hoax, I personally don't know how you address that. If someone has chosen to believe that, or all the other stuff that the brain juice salesmen spout, people living in Arkansas who are more concerned about crime in Gothenburg committed by brown people than they are about crime at the bottom of their own garden committed by opioid-addicted white people. How do you engage with that level of madness?
Well, I think you engage with that level of madness by actually putting it out into the...
But who does? Because the Facebook feed is now being manipulated and groomed to offer up only endorsements of the madness.
Yeah, well, it's it's unfortunate that.
See, I can have a debate with anyone, but once they start lying, and we both know that they're lying, but they pretend that they're not lying, I can't win that debate.
And this is the problem. And the solution, I think people will go for a lazy solution. And the lazy solution is, well, let's shut down these organisations. But then it gives more power to the people that are saying there's some kind of conspiracy.
And that's a perfect circle, isn't it? Or a perfect storm. I mean, if you can't disprove a lie, you can't persuade these people that, I don't know, buying these tablets, this juice isn't going to make their brain work faster, or persuade them that, no, those people on the telly whose children just got killed, they are real. Those vapor trails in the sky, they're not going to turn you into a woman or a goat or whatever today's suggestion might be. If I can't persuade you of that, and then I just stop the people telling you it's true from telling you it's true. But I think it would diminish. And this is the reality, human reality, isn't it, rather than ideal principles. Because if you turn down the volume to zero, then it withers and dies.
Would just kick in. Because they'll say, well, you've just turned off the very air that I believe, therefore it must have been true.
Yeah. Yeah, that government, BBC conspiracy, me, all that sort of thing. So what are we going to do then? Quick, Craig, we've only got 2 minutes. What are you going to do? How are you going to save humanity from this existential threat?
The solution is to actually get these people onto the panels of question time.
It's not, because you can't invite liars on to tell lies. Well, is it the solution?
Well, it worked well with Nick Griffin, though, didn't it?
Oh, I kind of did, although Nick Griffin wasn't a very good demagogue. He wasn't a very good propagandist. He didn't go to the right school. He doesn't wear the right clothes. Doff cap, tug forelock, vote Rees-Mogg. It wasn't the message that did for Nick Griffin. It was the messenger with his slightly flabby face and his slightly odd dress sense and his general demeanour. He didn't look
so
like...
we're always going to have the problem of style over substance then, aren't we?
We always are going to have the problem of style over substance, but I think somewhere between our two positions lies a beginning of an answer, which would be if someone tells a lie on somewhere like Question Time about borders or about fish or about passports or about immigration or about anything under the sun, really you should be slapped around the face with the evidence of that lie. You don't just get to go, oh, well, let's move on. You get hit again and again and again with the incontrovertible proof that you are a lying, racist scumbag. What you don't do is invite them back week after week after week after week to continue telling their racist lies because it's good for ratings. A little more on this because I find it so interesting and so close to home as well. How do people who used to be normal and nice end up believing all manner of mad stuff about all manner of mad things? It's not the most... sophisticated inquiry I've ever issued on the programme. We're talking about Cambridge Analytica and the growing body of evidence that suggests your Facebook feed can tell people more about your weaknesses, your fears, your secret prejudices than even your own partner would realise. It's still a little bit hard to swallow, isn't it? Until you actually meet someone who's fallen for it. I meet millions, more than anybody should have to, but that's why they pay me the silly money. I'm bombarded daily with people who are utterly persuaded of all of the things that you may, listening to this programme, think I've slightly exaggerated. All Muslims are paedophiles and terrorists, and the ones that are pretending not to be, they're not proper Muslims because they haven't read the Quran, and I have. That's a very, very widespread position. The InfoWars Breitbart axis that passes off racist propaganda as news and tells you more about crimes in countries like Germany and Sweden in an attempt to persuade poor people in, I don't know, Idaho to vote for Donald Trump. If you don't vote for Donald Trump, it'll be just like Sweden. Here's a Swedish person describing Sweden. Yeah, but seriously, InfoWars. That's how it works. And so don't think that the Facebook story is just about Facebook, because what are these videos and stories that pop into the feeds of the people who've been manipulated by the propagandists? They come from these weird websites. And I would trace a lot of it back to more respectable media. I think The Spectator magazine has an awful lot to answer for sort of mainstreaming and mainlining what I'd call posh Islamophobia. And then, of course, if you do it in a posh accent, doff cap, tug forelock, vote Rees-Mogg, you get away with a hell of a lot more than you ever could if you were doing it with a shaved head and Doc Martin boots. 'Twas ever thus, you know. no accident that Oswald Mosley was on the fringes of the aristocracy. If he'd come up from a humbler stock, he wouldn't have garnered anything like the attention he did. He certainly wouldn't have become beloved of the then owner of the Daily Mail. Ryan's in Brighton. Ryan, let's have another go. Tell me about your dad.
Hello there. Yeah, so what it is, basically, it started, I said, after reunion with some old friends from years ago in the army, and my dad just started putting all these things on Facebook about, it started with just, political things about Brexit and everything else, and then it developed into more kind of hatred towards all Muslims, saying that the Quran, videos of people saying that the Quran was inherently bad, that it was evil and promoted rape of children and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And then it got to the point recently where I just stopped engaging, because I tried to sort of debate with him, and it got to the point where he was putting on pictures of, the little characters on marmalade jars from years ago, saying that they should bring those back, and he has quite a nice life. Ironically enough, in Spain, he's very much against free movement of people, but he lives in Spain.
Oh, nice.
And up in the mountains, it's quite idyllic. He lives there together. He just sort of potters around on his little plot of land.
And then he goes on Facebook to feed this...
Yeah, exactly. It seems bizarre.
What does he get out of it?
I don't know. I mean, my mum did say that, when he was younger, he did say quite disturbing things about disabled people. Saying
oh, really?
Be put down or something. It was all...
Blimey.
He always had that, and he's saying, luckily it wasn't a major part of my life for quite a long time. So
okay.
It was kind of, it's quite unsettling, and then, so there was always there.
Well, that tallies with the data mining, doesn't it? The idea that it identifies something that may actually be quite well hidden, because presumably your dad doesn't march around the Spanish mountains sharing his views on the extermination of disabled people. But Facebook, this clever psychological profiling or data mining can pick up on that kind of mindset. I mean, what do you do? Just close it down like David does with his brother? You just can't go there anymore? Yeah,
I mean, I actually kind of unfriended him, to be honest. I wasn't getting any... Because I did sort of block him from my posts.
Yeah.
But then you get, like you say, it's quite addictive, isn't it, to argue, okay?
It is, and I think...
And go, well, I want to have a go at him about this because this is really wrong, And he just thought it's best just to cut all ties.
And you end up feeling trolled, actually. You think, well, I can't win an argument with somebody who I mean, you can't win an argument with someone who's lying. Whether they know they're lying or not, you can't win it. And that is almost the kind of jackpot.
Before about, I remember this from This Is England. I remember in the 80s, and the film This Is England,
yes,
where there was this idea of kind of martyrdom almost in these countries. You're a minority, but you're standing up for something because everyone's too scared to, and this is the truth. And the BBC are peddling these lies. They've got a self-interest in the elite.
You sort of become a sort of doughty crusader against a non-existent enemy, but my God, you're going to crusade like there's no tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And then elites leading inexorably to the men who actually own the Ritz Hotel, bankrolling demagogues and racist liars who go out there and bleat about the elites ruining the country, the elites and the immigrants, but not the people who own the Ritz.
Yeah. And that's the thing, I mean, it's whatever your counter-argument is, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? It's kind of...
yes. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're going to examine a few more case studies, and the phone line's gone a bit rubbish again, so very briefly.
Yeah.
I can't think... I mean, how do you deal with it? Because without blowing smoke up my own backside, this radio programme has probably become, in the last 2 or 3 years, one of the most prominent places where these ideas and these arguments get completely demolished and dismantled. And then 3 or 4 million people watch it online. But I know that most of those callers don't go away thinking they were wrong. They go away feeling humiliated and bruised and completely owned, but then they get back on Facebook and they start clicking and liking, and suddenly they're back down the rabbit hole again. How do you get them out of it?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing with the kind of hardcore Brexiteers, isn't it? It's this belief that whatever anyone says, you can't do not. You've gone along with this, so you can't kind of go back on it.
Although I think on National Fish Day we should refrain from being too rude about them. It's 10 minutes after 12. Ryan, thank you. Apologies to everybody who was unhappy with that phone line, but I wanted to hear what Ryan had to say. Les is in Glasgow. Les, what do you want to say?
Oh, hello, James. How are you doing?
Les,
first, I'm calling very, very nervous.
Don't be. It's only me, Les. It's only me.
Big fan. Look, well, I am Polish. I can hear my accent, okay? And we started coming here to Britain about 15 years ago. And obviously, I brought here my family and everything. I grew up in Poland like my brothers, and we were never actually exposed to any Muslim culture, no multiculturalism, nothing. Since we came here, it became absolutely nightmare. And now, about 3-4 years ago, my brother, he actually was not exposed to any far-right propaganda from the Facebook or anything. It was basically from the Polish priests posting stuff on their YouTube.
Crikey.
And yeah, I know. And so, because they don't speak very good English, so they obviously wouldn't be able to go on Facebook and listen to, I don't know, anyone from America.
Sure.
So since then, actually, they started going about 4 years ago. They started going to the Birmingham for the demonstrations against Muslims, refugees coming here. And now we got to the point that it's so aggressive. I just don't see him no more. It's just unbelievable.
Really?
Yeah. It's just the whole family basically.
Is it Meadlar? Is that the priest?
Yes, it's quite a few of them. As you know.
Well, I know that one was banned from coming into Britain, of course, but for being a fanatical hate preacher. Of course, people who insist that we can't control our borders have very odd little contortions when we actually use our borders to keep out hate preachers. It happened to an American woman last week, but what does your brother get out of it? Do you think? What does it feed within him? Because you're of the same blood, which is the kind of language that these clowns enjoy. So what's happened to him that didn't happen to you? What do you think is the explanation?
Funny enough, I was just thinking about this when you asked this blog before. What is your father getting out of it?
Yes.
And, I think that actually my brother is one of those you call left behind.
Right.
And,
yes.
You know what I mean? It's, haven't done much in life, can't speak good English, basically low-paid job, working all day.
Must be someone else's fault. Must be someone else's fault.
Yes.
And he doesn't realise, have you tried to explain to him that I could now open up my phone lines, it would take me 30 seconds to find someone who would describe themselves as indigenous white British, and he thinks the reason why his life is rubbish is because of people like your brother coming over here, stealing our jobs, taking our benefits.
But what they don't really realize is that today they're going with this, I think it's the first Britain they demonstrate with.
Yes.
Then tomorrow it will be them. They will be demonstrating against Poles. So
that's it, isn't it? It'll be the anti-Muslim march last week, marching against Muslims, alongside people who next week are going on the anti-Polish march around the corner.
Yep. You can actually see, I don't know, there was last week in news, there was this guy from far right, I don't know the names, they actually were coming out of the court, and you can actually see guys behind them with the T-shirts saying Polska, which basically means Poland.
Yeah. Poland has a massive problem with the far right, arguably and historically bigger than ours. But it's interesting to see the two worlds meld, and the anti-Islam feeling that your brother feels, to me, is just the other side of the anti-E. It's not long ago that people were trying to persuade. They were campaigning during the European Union referendum campaign by complaining about people speaking foreign on public transport. That's you. That's your brother, that is. And next week he's marching alongside them.
Yeah, because it makes them feel good.
It makes them feel good. And that, I think, is where Les and I and everybody else who's rung in so far begins to lose sight of the story, because I can't quite understand how it would make you feel good. So tell me, if you've been down this rabbit hole and managed to climb out of it, then what is it you get out? Various suggestions today that it makes you feel special because you get it and no one else does. Or the slightly unkind suggestion that if your life's gone a bit rubbish, then you don't really want it to be your fault. You want it to be someone else's fault. Or what else is that? I guess there are a small number of people, and however much evidence is amassed, I don't think I ever want to believe that they're any bigger than small, who have just been sitting waiting for this. You're full on. It's like Steve Bannon said in France the other day, be proud of being called a racist. That those people sort of lead it. But if you're getting a kick out of following, what's in it for you? It's 12:15. I enjoy going down the rabbit hole. I can't read out half of the stuff that comes in, but my goodness me, if you needed evidence that this Cambridge Analytica story is almost certainly true, you don't have to dip your toe very far into social media to see the results of weaponised propaganda and manipulation and lies. But we're going to move on, largely because I suspect we're going to be talking about this story quite a lot this week, and that question, we'll leave it hanging Have a little think about it as well, and we'll talk about it later in the week. The friend or the family member who now you realise has been a guinea pig. They have been absolutely on the receiving end of this so-called data mining, because that's the bit, isn't it, that's broken through today. That's the penny that's dropped. Is how can these people be living in such an echo chamber, such an unleavened diet of hateful nonsense? This obsession with crime figures in Sweden from people who live in Nuneaton or Nebraska. What is that about? Well, it works. and I get it now. Of course it works. I think it's as old as the hills. There's some people, they wish you ill. They're quite sly, so you may not be able to see them, but they're there. Sometimes their head appears above the water, like in Sweden. Oh, crikey. We better build a wall between America and Mexico then, because Sweden. That is it. So you and me try and logically break it. It's not logic, is it? Let's play that clip again and then we'll leave it from the guy, the MD of Cambridge Analytica, not the Knicks guy, the Turnbull guy, because that was it. And how many times have I said to you, it's got nothing to do with facts and everything to do with feelings, particularly in the context of Trump and Brexit. It's everything to do with feelings, nothing to do with facts. I've said it to you since, well, even I'm bored of hearing me say it, and that takes quite something. But what had never occurred to me was that instead of trying to use the privilege of my position to point this out, I should have put it in my back pocket and used it to make money. I should have been out there punting the feelings, lying to people, pouring poisonous, hate-filled bile into their ears, and then submitting a fat invoice at the end of it. I know people in my line of work do it, but God knows if you could have done it on this kind of scale, we could all have retired last year. 21 after 12.
The two fundamental human drivers when it comes to taking information on board effectively are hopes and fears, and many of those are unspoken and even unconscious. You didn't know that was a fear until you saw something that just evoked that reaction from you.
Right.
And our job is to drop the bucket further down the well than anybody else, to understand what are those really deep-seated underlying fears, concerns. There's no good fighting an election campaign on the facts, because actually it's all about emotion.
It is 22 minutes after 12. It's all about emotion. And there it is. And we'll find out who paid them. We'll find out where some of the curious donations, including some that the DUP were involved in, and whether or not any of that money made its way in any of these direct... We'll get to the bottom of this. But, of course, by the time we do, it'll probably be too late to undo the damage that feeding those emotions and ignoring those facts has visited upon us.